Good morning. Um, I recorded chapters 3 and 4 yesterday and it uploaded, and then the link disappeared somehow. So we are going to try this again. I have a little bit of a cough, so hopefully I don't have to stop too often. And Jupiter wants to say hi. He is also enjoying the people of Sparks. So, chapter 3, Through the Village. The woman who had greeted them led the people of Ember into the town. They went down a dusty street, past buildings that looked as if they had been made out of the same brown earth that was underfoot. They were heavy-looking, imperfect buildings. Their walls were fat and lumpy, rounded smooth at the corners. Lena saw cracks in the walls and crumbled places where bits of a window ledge or a step had fallen away. Paths and alleys and strips of garden wound between the houses. It was clear that no one had planned this place, not the way the builders had planned Ember. This town must have grown, one bit added to the next and another bit added after that. Plants grew everywhere. In Ember, the only plants were in the greenhouses, unless you count mold and fungus, which grew on the trash heaps and sometimes in kitchens and bathrooms. Here, flowers and vegetables grew together beside every house. Plants sprang up alongside the streets, climbed walls, crawled over fences, pushed up through cracks and stairways, tumbled out of big pots and over windowsills, and even on the roofs. There were animals too. Huge, amazing, terrifying animals. In a fence in place at the edge of the town, Lena saw 4 brown animals much bigger than she was, with squarish heads and long tassel tails. Farther on, tethered to a post in front of a house, was a yellow-eyed creature with 2 spikes poking out of its head. When she walked by it, it suddenly said, "Ma," and she skittered away in fright. She turned to look for Dune, who had fallen a little behind. She found him stooping over, peering at some yellow flowers growing next to a wall. "Look at this," he said when she came up beside him. He pointed to a flower's tube-shaped center. "There's a spider in there the exact same yellow as the flower." There was. Only Dune would notice such a thing. Tugging at the sleeve of his jacket, she said, "Come on, stay with us," and she hurried him toward the front of the line to join his father and Mrs. Murdo and Poppy. These 4 people, Poppy and Mrs. Murdo, Dune and his father, were Lena's family now, and she wanted them close around her. Only Poppy was really related to her, but Mrs. Murdo was like a mother. She had taken Lena and Poppy into her house when their granny died, and she would have kept them if they hadn't had to leave the city. Dune's father was part of her family just because he was Dune's father. And Dune himself, he was the one who had been Lena's partner in finding the way out of Ember. There was a connection between them that would now never be broken. On they walked, down one street and up another, around curves and down through narrow passages. Everywhere people stared at them. Some leaned from open windows. Some sat up on their roofs, their legs dangling over the side. Some stood still in the midst of work they had been doing, their shovels or brooms in their hands. These people were taller and browner than the people of Ember. But were they friendly? Lena couldn't tell. A few children waved and giggled. After a while, the refugees came out from the narrow streets into a wide open area. This must be like Ember's Harkin Square, Lena thought, a place in the center of town where people gathered. It wasn't square, though. It was more like a rough half-circle paved in dusty brown brick. "What is this place called?" Lena asked Mary Waters, who was walking just ahead of her. "The Plaza," Mary said. Plaza. Lena had never heard that word before. It was her first New World word. On one side of the plaza was the river. On the other side were stalls with thatched roofs and small buildings with display racks out in front holding faded-looking clothes, shoes with thick black soles, candles, brooms, pots of honey and jam, along with plenty of things that Lena didn't recognize. A bigger building stood at the plaza's far end. It had white steps in front, a double door, and a tower with windows up high that looked out over the plaza. Next to it was a tremendous plant of some kind, a great pole much thicker than a building, with branches like graceful down-sweeping arms and leaves like bristles. "What is that?" Lena asked a woman who was staring at the edge of the plaza, watching them go by. The woman looked startled. That's our town hall. No, I mean the big plant next to it. Big plant? The pine tree? Pine tree, said Lena. I've never seen a pine tree. Her second word, pine tree. The woman gave her an odd look. Lena thanked her and just kept walking. Step this way, please, said Mary, who was trying to keep the unruly refugees in order. There's plenty of water for you here, both in the river and in the fountain. She pointed to the middle of the plaza, where there was a pool of water circled by a low wall. The water in the middle of the pool jumped up into a column of bubble and spray and splashed back down and jumped up again constantly. The people of Ember surged forward. Dozens ran to the edge of the river and bent down to bathe their faces in water. Dozens more crowded around the pool. Children splashed their hands in it, crawled up on the rim, and tried to reach the leaping water in the middle. Some of the children jumped in and had to be hauled out by their parents. People at the rear of the crowd pushed forward, but people at the front weren't ready to be pushed. Suddenly there was yelling and jostling and water sloshing out into the pavement. Lena slipped and fell down, and someone tripped over her too. Please, shouted Mary, her deep, loud voice rising above the uproar. Order! Order! Shouted a man's voice. Lena heard other voices too. As she struggled to get to her feet, the voices of the villagers crowding in at the edge of the plaza. Get back, Tommy! Get away from them! Where did you say you were from again? Under the ground? Are they people like us, Mama? A child asked. Or some other kind? Of course we're like you, thought Lena, aren't we? Are there more kinds of people than just one? She got to her feet and wrung out the hem of her sweater, which was sopping wet. She spotted Mrs. Murdo on the other side of the plaza and headed toward her. The commotion finally subsided. The people of Ember, their thirst quenched, gazed about them in wonder. Everything was strange and fascinating to them. They stood with their heads craned back, gazing at the towering plants and the peeping creatures that flitted in around them. They stooped down to touch the bright flowers. They peered in doorways and windows. Children ran down the grassy bank to the river, tore off their shoes and socks, and dunked their feet in the water. Old people, exhausted from the long walk, lay down behind bushes and went to sleep. The 3 town leaders began moving among the people of their village, talking with them in low voices for a minute or two, and then nodding and moving on. Lena saw those townspeople glance at the new arrivals with worried looks. They didn't seem to know what to say. Lena couldn't understand why. What would the mayor of Ember have done, for instance, if 400 people had suddenly arrived into the unknown regions? By this time, the sky was beginning to darken. A few townspeople started calling the refugees together. Come this way. Call your children. Please sit down. They stood at the edges of the crowd with their arms stretched out and nudged people inward until finally all 400 people were squeezed into the plaza, gathered around the wide steps in front of the town hall where the 3 leaders were standing. Mary Waters raised her arms above her head and stood that way without speaking for several seconds. She looked powerful, Lena thought, even though she was very short. The way she stood with her feet planted slightly apart and her back straight made her seem almost to be growing out of the ground. Her black hair was streaked with gray, but her face was smooth and strong-boned. Gradually, people fell silent and turned their attention to her. Greetings, she cried. My name is Mary Waters. This is Ben Barlow. She pointed to one of the men standing next to her, a wiry man with a stiff, gray, box-like beard jutting from his chin. He had 2 wrinkles, like the number 11, right in between his eyebrows. And this is Wilmer Dent, she said, pointing to the other man. He was tall and thin, with wispy, rust-colored hair. He smiled a wavering smile and waggled a few fingers in greeting. We are the 3 leaders of this village, which we call Sparks. 322 people live here. I understand that you come from a city 3 days' walk away. I must say, this is a surprise to us. We have not been made aware of any post-disaster settlements nearby, much less an entire city. What does post-disaster mean? Lena whispered to Dune. I don't know, Dune said. Mary Waters cleared her throat with a gruff sound and took a breath. We will do our best for you tonight, and then tomorrow we will talk about your plans. Some of our households are willing to take in a few of you for the night, those with young children and those who are old and ill. The rest of you may sleep here in the plaza. Those who go with the householders will share in their evening meal. Those who stay with here will be given bread and fruit. There was a scattering of applause from the people of Ember. Thank you, several voices cried out. Thank you so much. What's bread? Lena whispered to Dune. He just shrugged his shoulders. Will all those who most need shelter for the night please stand? Mary Waters called. As I said, those with children, the elderly, and the ill. A rustle swept through the crowd as people got to their feet. Voices murmured, Stand up, Father. You go, Willa. No, I'm all right. You go. Let Arno go. He sprained his foot. Because of Poppy, Lena and Mrs. Murdo stood up. Dune remained sitting, and so did his father. The brilliant yellow ball in the sky was traveling downward now, and the shadows grew longer. Night was coming, and with the gathering darkness, Lena's spirits grew darker too. She thought of the green and blue bedroom she had moved into back at Mrs. Murdo's house in Ember, the lovely room she had been so glad to have. She was homesick for it. Right now, she would have been happy to have a bowl of turnip soup and crawl between the covers of the bed in that room with Poppy right next to her, and Mrs. Murdo out in the living room tidying up, and the great clock of Ember about to strike 9, the hour when the lights went out. She knew that place, the village of Sparks, was alive, but Ember was dead, and she would never go back there, even if she could. But right now, as the air grew chilly and whispered against her skin, and a strange bed in a stranger's house waited for her, she longed for what was familiar. Mary Waters was calling out names. At each name, someone from the village stepped up and said how many people that household could take. Leah Parsons. A tall woman in a black dress came forward. 2 people, she said, and Mary Waters pointed at an old couple at the front of the crowd of refugees who picked up their bags and followed the tall woman. Randolph Bonito, called Mary, and a big red-faced man said, 5. The Kendrick family, with their 3 small children, went with them. Evers Mills, 4. Lanny McMorris, 2. Jane Garcia, 3. It went on for a long time. The sky grew darker and the air cooler. Lena shivered. She untied her sweater from around her waist and put it on. Light and warmth must go together here, she thought. Warm in the day when the bright light was in the sky, and cool at night. In Ember, the lights made no heat at all, and the temperature was always the same. At the edges of the plaza, someone was raising a flame-tipped stick and lighting lanterns that hung from the eaves of buildings. They glowed deep yellow and red. Mary was pointing at Mrs. Murdo now. You, ma'am. Your child looks the sickest of anyone. We will send you home with our doctor. She beckoned to a woman standing nearby, a tall, bony old woman with bushy gray hair chopped off just below her ears. She was wearing loose pants of faded blue and a rumpled tan shirt that was buttoned crookedly, so one side hung down lower than the other. Dr. Hester will take you, Mary said. Dr. Hester Crane. Lena stood there. She turned to Dune. Will you be okay here? She said. It made her uneasy to be separated from Dune and his father. We'll be fine, Dune said. No need to worry, said his father, spreading a blanket on the ground. The doctor stooped down to look at Poppy, who drowsed in Mrs. Murdo's arms. She put a hand on Poppy's forehead, a big, knuckly hand with veins like blue yarn. She pulled down the underside of Poppy's eyes. Mm-hmm, she said. Yes, well, come along. I'll do what I can for her. Lena cast an anxious glance at Dune. Come and find me in the morning, Dune said. We will be right here. This way, the doctor said. Oh, wait. She scanned the mostly empty plaza. Torin, she called. Lena heard the slap of footsteps on brick and saw a boy running toward them out of the darkness. We're going home now, the doctor said to him. These people are coming with us. The boy was younger than Lena. He had a strangely narrow face, as if someone had put a hand on either side of his head and pushed hard. His eyes were round blue dots. Above his high forehead, his light brown hair stood in an untidy tuft. He glared sideways at Lena and said nothing. The doctor headed up the road beside the river, walking with a long stride, her hands in her pockets and her head bent forward as if she were looking for something on the ground. Staying close beside Mrs. Murdo, she was carrying the sleeping Poppy. Lena followed. The chilly evening air crept in through the threads of her sweater, and an insect hovering near her ear made a high needle-like whine. The homesick feeling swelled so big inside her that she had to cross her arms tightly and clench her teeth to keep it from coming out. Alright, so that was chapter 3. What are you thinking about everything that's going on? So all these people from the city of Ember have come to the city of Sparks. And Lena is trying to put herself into their shoes of, well, how would the city of Sparks react? How would the city of Ember reacted if an entire city made their way underground to join their city? So they're trying to have a little bit of empathy while everyone's trying to kind of figure out about each other. Excuse me. Chapter 4, The Doctor's House. The sky had turned a deep blue now, almost black. At one edge shone a streak of brilliant crimson, and the houses of the village, one window and then another, began to glow with a flickering yellow light. They walked and walked. Each time they came to a doorway, or a gate in a wall, or stairs leading upward, Lena hoped that this would be the house. Back in Ember, where she had the job of messenger, she had been a tireless runner. Running was her greatest joy. Tonight, it was hard just to walk. She was so tired her feet felt like bricks. But Dr. Hester walked on, with the boy trotting ahead of her sometimes, and sometimes lagging back to stare at Lena and Mrs. Murdo and Poppy. Until they came to the outer edge of the village. There, standing somewhat apart, was a low-roofed house. Except for a glimmer of light on its 2 windows reflected from the reddening sky, it was in darkness, huddled beneath a great, brooding plant the shape of a giant mushroom. "Is that a pine tree?" Lena asked the doctor. "Oak tree," the doctor said. So Lena understood that tree must mean all big plants, and they come in different kinds. A path led to a wooden gate, which the doctor opened. They came into a shadowy, leaf-littered courtyard paved with uneven bricks. On 3 sides were the 3 wings of the house, like a square-cornered U. The eaves of the roof sloped down to form a walkway all around. In the failing light, Lena could just see the courtyard was crowded with plants, some growing in the ground and some in pots of all sizes. Vines wound up the columns of the walkway and crawled along the edge of the roof. "Come inside," the doctor said. She led the way to the door in the central part of the house. She and the boy went in. Lena stopped just inside the doorway, and Mrs. Murdo came up behind her, Poppy in her arms. They stood peering into the gloom. There was an odd, pungent smell, like mushrooms or leaf mold, only sharper. The doctor disappeared for a moment, and when she came back, she held a lit candle. She moved around the room, lighting more. 2 candles, 3 candles, 4, until a wavery light filled the central part of the room. The corners remained in darkness. Come in, the doctor said impatiently. Lena moved forward. She felt grit beneath the soles of her shoes, the tickle of dust in her nose. She was in a long, low room with clutter everywhere, clothes draped over the backs of armchairs, a shoe on a saggy couch, a plate with some bits of food on it sitting on the windowsill. At one end of the room were 2 doors, both of them closed. At the back, a stairway rose into a dark hole in the ceiling. At the other end of the room, in the corner, was an open doorway, leading, Lena guessed, to a kitchen. Beside this doorway was a kind of hollow in the wall, framed by stones and containing some sticks and scraps of paper. The doctor stooped down below this hollow place and held her candle to the sticks and paper there. In a moment, a flame leapt up. It was a bigger flame than Lena had ever seen, like a terrible orange hand reaching up and down. Lena's heart knocked hard against her ribs. She stepped backward, bumping into Mrs. Murdo. They stood staring, Mrs. Murdo with a hand clutching onto Lena's shoulder. The doctor turned around and saw them. "What's the matter?" she said. Lena couldn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, which leapt higher and crackled. Mrs. Murdo tried to answer. It's. She inclined her head toward the end of the room where the first flame had become a dozen flames, looking upward, sending out flashes of orange light. Oh, said the doctor, the fire. You're not used to a fire? Mrs. Murdo managed to smile apologetically. Lena just kept staring. It stays in the fireplace, the doctor said. Not at all dangerous. In Ember, there was never fire unless there was danger. Someone's electric wiring had frayed and ignited, or a potholder had fallen on a stove's electric burner. The only fire Lena had ever seen that wasn't dangerous was that tiny flame on the candle. This fire did scare her. In the window glass, reflections glimmered. The windows were set so deeply into the walls that there was a ledge at the bottom wide enough to sit on. The boy Torin hiked himself up on one of these ledges and sat there, kicking his feet against the cabinet set in the wall below it. Afraid of fire, he said in a low, scornful voice. Come in, the doctor said. You can sit over there if you like. She pointed to some chairs at the other end of the room, far from the fire, so that was where Lena and Mrs. Murdo sat. Poppy woke up enough to give a weak cry, and then she slumped back into Mrs. Murdo's lap. This will likely be the last fire of the season anyways, said the doctor. Nights are getting warmer. We won't need one soon. A creak sounded from outside, and then rapid footsteps. Someone pounded on the door. Lena clutched onto Mrs. Murdo's hand. But the doctor only sighed and moved to answer the door. Oh, it's you, William. What do you need? She said. Some of that ointment? I need it right now. My wife cut her hand. It's bleeding everywhere. Come on, come in. I'll get it, the doctor said, and she went into another room and rummaged around while the man just shyly stood inside the door, looking out of the corners of his eyes at Lena and Mrs. Murdo. The doctor brought him a jar of ointment, and he went away. No more than 10 minutes later, another knock came, this time from a young woman who wanted some willow bark medicine for her sister, who had a pounding headache. Again, the doctor rattled around in the other room. She came out with a small bottle, and the woman hurried off with it. Are you the only doctor here? Mrs. Murdo inquired. Yes, said Dr. Hester. It's a never-ending job. She suddenly looked worried. Wait, did I give William the right jar? Yes, I did. The third one on the shelf. I'm sure I did. She gave a frazzled sigh. Now let's tend to your little girl. Put her down here. She patted the couch that stood against the wall. And wrap her in this. She retrieved a knitted blanket that had fallen on the floor. She gave it a shake and then handed it to Mrs. Murdo. I'll give her a swallow of medicine. Poppy accepted two spoonfuls of medicine. It was something reddish that Dr. Hester poured from a jar. But Poppy spit out the third, whimpering. Lena's heart ached to see Poppy so sick. Most of the time, Poppy was a ball of energy, so quick and curious you never knew what she would do next. She might chew up a whole valuable document, for instance, or trot off on an exploration of her own at exactly the wrong moment. Now she was limp and pale, like a little sprout that needed to be watered. Mrs. Murdo laid her on the bed. Lena sat by her and stroked her hair, and quite soon she fell asleep. The doctor disappeared into the kitchen, and Torin climbed the stairs and vanished into the room above. All at once, Lena was overcome with tiredness. The disorderly house, the unfriendly boy, the fire, all of it was strange and disturbing, and Poppy was terribly sick, which worried Lena so much that she felt a little sick herself. She sat down by Mrs. Murdo and laid her head on Mrs. Murdo's lap. She was vaguely aware of clattering and chopping noises coming from the kitchen, and then she dozed off into a confusing dream of lights and shadows. Dinner! Shouted Torin. Lena bolted upright, and he laughed. Haven't you heard of food? Have you even heard of eating? He said. They sat at the table, all of them but Poppy, and the doctor ladled out something from a big bowl. Lena wasn't sure what it was. Cold potatoes, she thought, and something else. She ate it because she was so hungry, but when she had eaten, she suddenly became so tired that she could hardly move. Quite tasty, said Mrs. Murdo. Thank you. Well, said the doctor, certainly. You're welcome. She started to stand up, then sat down again, looking flustered. Maybe you would like to read, or take a walk, or... We're a bit tired, said Mrs. Murdo. Perhaps we could just go to bed. Dr. Hester's face brightened. Bed. Yes, she said, standing up. Of course. Why didn't I? Let's see. Where will we put you? She looked around as if an extra bed just might be hidden in all the mess. The loft, I suppose? No, cried Torrin. That's my room. It's the only place with 2 beds, said Dr. Hester. Picking up a candle, she made her way through the clutter to the stairway. They're going to touch my stuff and Casper's things, cried Torrin. Don't be silly, said Dr. Hester, staring up the stairs. But where will I sleep? Torrin wailed. In the medicine room, said Dr. Hester. Tears had appeared in Torrin's eyes, but the doctor didn't notice. She disappeared into the loft, and for a few minutes Lena heard thumps and scrapes from above. Come on up, the doctor called. Lena climbed the stairs, and Mrs. Murdo came after, carrying Poppy. By the light of the doctor's candle, Lena saw 2 beds under a sloping ceiling. There was a chest at the foot of each bed. Some clothes hung from hooks, and some boxes were neatly lined up on the sill of the one window. 2 beds, but 3 of you, said the doctor, frowning. We could put the baby... It's all right, Lena said. She'll sleep with me. And a few minutes later, she was in bed, Poppy in the crook of her arms, covers drawn over them. Good night, Mrs. Murdo said from the other bed, and the candle was blown out, and the room went dark, but not as dark as the rooms in Ember at night. Lena could still see a faint gray rectangle where the window was. Because of the lights in the city, the silver circle in the sky, and the bright pinpoints. What are those called? She wondered. And who is Casper? And how can the doctor stand to have that huge, awful fire right there in the floor of her own house? Everything here was the opposite of Ember. Ember was dark and cold. This place was bright and hot. Ember was orderly. This place was disorderly. In Ember, everything was familiar to her. Here, everything was strange. Will I learn to like it here? She wondered. Will I ever feel at home? She held Poppy tight against her and listened to her snuffly breathing for a long time before she fell asleep. Alright, so that's the end of chapter 4. And I would love to hear what you are thinking, your thoughts about this chapter, and you can do some comments below and let me know what you were thinking about the book so far. Alright, I'm going to be reading chapters 4 and 5 on a separate video, and I will be posting those as soon as I can. Have a great day, guys. Bye.